Welcome everybody to the South Asia Initiative at Stanford's Asia Pacific Research Center for the first webinar of the new academic year. Today we are going to discuss again Afghanistan. By coincidence, today's actually the eve of the 20th anniversary of Operation Enduring Freedom, the US military campaign. And we last ran an event on Afghanistan about 6 months ago, more or less, just after President Biden had announced his plan to withdraw forces. And at that time, there was so much uncertainty, some of which has been resolved, not necessarily in a positive way, and things have changed quickly. Now, it's already been almost 2 months since the Taliban took control of Kabul. There's been a lot of commentary about the policy catastrophe of the US withdrawal and about the heart-wrenching scenes coming out of Afghanistan where the Taliban seem to be as brutal and repressive as they ever were. There's plenty of those issues being discussed and will be discussed for a long time elsewhere. But here today, we are going to zoom out a little and consider the impact of the Taliban takeover on the region. What does it mean for Pakistan, which for so long has sponsored the Taliban? What does it mean for Kashmir and for transnational terrorism and for China and India? To shed light on these issues, I'm stoked to have this this group of stellar experts. You can read their bios on the webpage, so I won't repeat them, but by way of brief introduction, we have with us Ambassador Javid Ahmad, now back at the Atlantic Council, but until very recently, Afghanistan's ambassador to the UAE. He's also an expert on the Taliban and other violent extremist networks and illicit networks. We have with us Professor Christine Fair from Georgetown, who is a true South Asianist who speaks many South Asian languages and teaches them, and has written extensively on Pakistan's military and strategy and regional extremists like LET. And we have with us Dr. Avinash Paliwal from SOAS, another close observer of Afghanistan and good for us, especially from a regional perspective. He's written the definitive book on India's policy towards Afghanistan. So welcome to you all. We have a ton to get through, as always. So let me just make a brief housekeeping announcement before we get underway. Like all our events, this is going to be in a Q&A sort of format. And I invite you out there in Zoom land to submit brief questions, please, through the Q&A function in Zoom, not chat, but Q&A. Time is short, so please bear with me. I will be ruthless in picking questions and probably bundling them together, so please keep them brief and keep them relevant. So let's begin. I'd like to start, if I may, by setting a bit of a baseline for Afghanistan's links to the region. Javid, I might start with you in asking, and I'll ask the others as well, can you give us a sort of high-level, broad description of what regional countries' interests are in Afghanistan?
Well, thank you, Arzan. Thank you for having me. It was great to be with you, with Dr. Fair. It's good to see you, of course, with Avinash. There is no shared political or economic understanding of Afghanistan among the regional countries. Unfortunately, in fact, we haven't even seen a functional consensus on Afghanistan's future between the countries of the region. So, at best, I would say there are competing interests between the countries. In each country in that region wants a very different thing, and they desire a very different outcome. In Afghanistan, and they desire that outcome, or a very different outcome August 15 as well. So now some of the countries' interests are also directly in conflict with the next. Perhaps the only common understanding of an interest that all countries of the region arguably have right now is a stable and a neutral Afghanistan. So ideally one that doesn't pose a terrorist threat to them. But then there's also no consensus on a shared definition of a terrorism or what a stable Afghanistan should look like. And you know, in some ways that's because some countries in the region are still very much pursuing that good terrorist and bad terrorist approach as an indispensable function of their Afghanistan policy. The other challenge is that I think there are also some countries in that region, and I would name names, start with Pakistan mainly, which have taken it up upon themselves for their own very nefarious reasons to be in the leading role in determining Afghanistan's future now, but also like in the immediate and longer run. So in doing so, they are at the moment engaged at different layers and at different levels, both at the security and also on the political side, with the new cast of characters in Kabul. And what the Pakistani leaders are doing is that they're personally directing government, but also state level affairs in Kabul. So this includes pretty much, everything from policy to personnel. Let me also say that there is arguably not a single country in that region who feel comfortable with Pakistan's, taking this lead role, or even with Pakistan's approach in Afghanistan. In fact, many of their countries in that region see it with great suspicion. So a general kind of, if you look at it more broadly, the regional countries' interest in Afghanistan is at best a Gordian knot. It's very complex. It's driven by increased skepticism. There's no regional level coordination. There's the interests have also become highly territorial and turfy. There's also a lot of smoke and mirror and ambiguity in policy and approach. And most of the countries are engaged in, very kind of dual track approach, one that has a public face and, and is undertaken over the table, and the other is under the table. And these approaches on a country level often also do not sync up. I think, several of the regional countries were essentially pushing for a Taliban takeover. But what they're now reckoning with is, some kind of a buyer's remorse. And I think that's the first challenge for the region, overall is living and dealing with the Taliban regime in their backyards. If we have time, I could get into, what specific countries in that region are thinking.
I think we'll try and explore some of them as we go. But before we do, I want to give a chance to Chris and Avinash to also provide a sort of scene-setting baseline for how you see regional countries' approaches to Afghanistan, sort of historically as well as now post August 15.
So first of all, thank you for holding this, and thank you also for being one of the very few organizers that have actually included Afghan voices. So I'm grateful to your sagacity and your recognition of the importance of that. And I'm really glad that Javid is here. He's an old friend of mine, and of course Avinash, who cannot admire the verve of Avinash's work. So I'm just really grateful to be included in this posse of awesomeness. So I've done a lot of work on Pakistan strategic culture. I think some of the things that I find really frustrating is in the Pakistani information operations arena. I just have to give my, my unfiltered applause to them for being able to do this so well and over such a wide number of countries and for such a very long period of time. I can't help but hear DGISI, Moeed Yusuf, and among others who are featured on NPR giving Pakistan's point of view. I also can't help but notice how disingenuous it is. I think part of Pakistan's story is that the whole project of jihad in Afghanistan was an American project that began as a result of the Soviet invasion in Afghanistan. This is a very popular canard. Even Hillary Clinton propounded it during her Senate confirmation, one of her discussions before one of the various Senate committees that she testified before. But the reality is that Afghanistan made a number of really important, fatefully terrible decisions with respect to its neighbors going back to 1947. It first argued that Pakistan was an illegal successor state to the Raj. And that meant that its agreements, for example, that it made with the British to make the Durand line the de facto border, it argued that since Pakistan is an illegal successor state, those commitments are no longer binding. It also initially voted against Pakistan's admission to the United Nations, and it would, of course, immediately rescind that objection. But Pakistani elites was like, how could Afghanistan do this without Indian support and imprimatur? There's no evidence, actually, that that was ever the case, but they did reverse it, but the damage was done. And Afghans also made very early military ingresses into several territories of Pakistan and a number of tribal areas in the Fatah, as well as in Balochistan. So from Pakistan's point of view, when it became an independent state in the Comity of Nations, it had inherited the most dangerous of the threat frontiers for which the British had built a very complicated security architecture. And it did so with a fraction of the Raj's resources. So the Pakistanis inherited the British notion of strategic depth, but it didn't inherit this comprehensive security architecture that the British had constructed. So we see from the late 1950s to the early 1960s, Pakistan is trying to develop influence operations in Afghanistan. And one of the earliest mechanisms that it uses is essentially the transplanting of the Jamaat-Islami. We know that by the early 1970s, Jamaat-Islami is a fully functional political Islam organization that's really rooted at Kabul University. And Jamaat-Islami, as we know, Rabbani, Ahmad Shah Massoud, Hekmatyar, this will be the milieu from which the seven donkeys, as they're called, will emerge. So we also know that when Daud ousted Zahir Shah, he began taking a number of steps with respect to the Durand Line, supporting the Beloit insurgency, and Pakistan that had just emerged from the 1971 war under Zulfikar Ali Bhutto was not going to compromise any more sovereignty. And so he saw an opportunity in the Islamists that were resisting Muhammad Daoud. And as he oppressed them for opposing his modernizing initiatives, they fled into Pakistan. And so it was actually under Zulfikar Ali Bhutto in 1973 who sets up the ISI cell. And he directs the ISI chief to begin crafting these 50 or so odd armed groups into what will become the seven donkeys, or the primary workhorses of the jihad. We know that he's assassinated, but we also know that Zia takes this project over with only a brief interregnum. So by the time the Americans get involved, it's really the summer of 1979, and it's kind of an awkward moment because Jimmy Carter had really big issues with Zia and his proliferation. And in April of 1979, he actually levies sanctions under the amended Glenn-Symington, the Glenn-Symington Amendment to the Foreign Assistance Act. So we're really constrained, right? We can't really help Pakistan because it's going to eventually require congressional waiving of those sanctions. And that doesn't really happen until President Reagan is elected in 1982. So there is this very long history, in essence, of Pakistan trying to orchestrate affairs in Afghanistan to cultivate this notion of strategic depth, which Pakistan inherited from the British. It does this throughout the up until about 1993, when Afghanistan is a civil war after the Soviets withdraw. Pakistan's backing Hekmatyar. And we know that the Taliban project emerges at around 93, 94, and Pakistan under Benazir Bhutto shifts courses, essentially, dumps Hekmatyar and puts their full weight behind the Taliban. And we also know that sometime around 2003, 2004, Pakistan, again, even though it's now formally a partner in the American so-called global war on terrorism, it basically does a U-turn on its ostensible U-turn. In my own analysis, I see evidence of this U-turn much earlier. But essentially throughout the last 20 years, Pakistan continues to support the Taliban. And Pakistan's military has lost every single conventional war, but we have to concede that Pakistan has two unconventional victories, one against its own democracy, but also against Afghan sovereignty.
So that's an excellent and really useful and rarely heard sort of historical context to Pakistani involvement in Afghanistan. So I appreciate it.
I just want to say that my source for this are Pakistani sources.
Sure.
So when Pakistanis say, oh, this is some kind of American or Hindustani sazish, I'm like, no, these are from people like General Arif working with Zia Abdul Sattar, who was the foreign secretary. My sources are exclusively Pakistani in drawing out this narrative.
Sure, great. No, thank you for that. That's an important point as well. Avinash, if I could ask you, we've heard about the context of Pakistan's involvement in Afghanistan. Could you just round this first section out by providing a little bit, just a brief teaser of India's involvement in Afghanistan, its approach to Afghanistan, its interests in Afghanistan?
Rizwan, first of all, thank you for having me here, and I'm really honored and delighted to be part of this very kind of August panel. And with Javid and Christine, again, I've learned a lot from their works, and I owe a lot to their work. So thank you for having me here. Look, just to kind of continue this conversation based on the two primary points that have been made by Javid and Christine. One, that the regional powers actually don't have a very clear consensual idea of what they really want in Afghanistan, neither across history nor going forward. There is clarity of what you actually want, even if there is kind of a sense of among countries, among neighbors, as to what you don't want in Afghanistan, right? India knows what it does not want in Afghanistan, but it would be difficult for New Delhi to articulate what kind of Afghanistan really is it looking at when it says it wants a stable, sovereign, territorially united Afghanistan. The body politic, right, is something that even New Delhi, for that matter, struggles with. And I think that this is a story of a struggling state. This is a story of neighbors struggling to come to terms with a geography which has historically been done quite a lot of injustice, right? Both during the colonial period, as has already very helpfully been laid out by Christine, but also post-independence. The post-colonial states not only inherited the strategic kind of concepts from the colonial Raj, but even the evolution of their approaches towards these so-called peripheries, right? And I'm thinking not just Afghanistan right now, I'm also thinking about Myanmar, because that's another area I'm looking at. If you look at how New Delhi, or for that matter, Beijing, has dealt with countries like Myanmar, spaces like Yunnan, right? Countries, even the periphery, in certain areas of Bangladesh or Bay of Bengal, you can see that this is a story of very conflicted state making and post-colonial state building. In that context, I would say one analytical kind of a uniform point that I have observed in India's behavior towards Afghanistan post-1947, of course, in different shapes and forms and to different degrees of intensity, is this desire to view Afghanistan as a state that India can have relationship with, mostly to counterbalance Pakistan, right? This is fundamentally different from kind of promoting or proposing or desiring democracy or inclusivity. I think that's a secondary concern for policymakers in Delhi, because they know, one, they cannot actually influence the body politic of Afghanistan itself, given limited capacities and capabilities of India itself. But at the same time, they have struggled to channelize Afghan nationalism in its vibrancy as a counterpoint to Pakistani nationalism. And that goes back to the moment of 1947, when Afghans really kind of dispute the Durand Line, and their own nationalism, post-colonial nationalism, is emergent as a conversation with newfound Pakistani nationalism in its, in all its complexity. And I think that has been the case till today. That was the case. You can observe whether it is in the 60s and 70s when big debates are happening about Cold War rivalries, what kind of developmental projects big powers should implement and execute in Afghanistan, what kind of service delivery, when the debate was less securitized, even if there were binaries which were becoming extremes between the Khalqis, the communists, and the Islamists in Afghanistan, right? I think 79 is a real dislocation of both the polity of Afghanistan, but also how the region deals with it, right? The moment Soviet Union enters, it completely rejigs the calculus both of Islamabad and of New Delhi in some very fundamental ways. And I think we often miss a very essential part, that between Christmas 1979, when the Soviet Union goes in, till I would say broadly December 1980, that 12-month period, neither India nor Pakistan are actually accepting of that intervention. India, of course, had a public posture of supporting the Soviet intervention because India was relying quite heavily on Soviet support. But behind the scene, Indira Gandhi is very actively saying to Moscow that you have made a mistake, the consequences of which we'll have to bear for a longer period of time than you will. And that's when the idea of SAARC, really emerges. The idea of South Asian cooperation actually came on the back of external power intervention in Afghanistan. And you can see how this dynamic plays out. It's a very counterintuitive point, right? Of course, then India-Pakistan rivalry takes its own shapes in the 80s and the 90s. Right now, and I'll stop after this point, I've written about this, and I firmly believe that this is a watershed moment for the subcontinent for sure, perhaps more. The rise of Taliban in Kabul, or the fall of Kabul that we have known for the past 2 decades, is going to qualitatively reshape the geopolitics of the region. There is a temptation, given how securitized regional foreign policies towards Afghanistan are, to look at this moment only in military terms. How many foreign terrorists will come and cross from Afghanistan and undertake attacks in China, in Pakistan, in India, in Iran, or elsewhere, right? There's a lot of focus on terrorism and counterterrorism, which I believe is actually missing the point. For the first time, in regional history, we are looking at the rise of an Islamist, right-wing Islamist entity for a period of time which will not be limited like it was in the 1990s. You're mainstreaming political Islamists, and that will have serious political consequences for the political health of the region. I'm much more concerned about that moving forward than just the military outcomes of that, which will, of course, which will manifest itself in those kind of conflicts. But still, this is a very different extreme moment for the region, coming back from which will be very difficult for the states involved.
That's a really important point, and I appreciate you raising it, because my inclination was also to sort of instinctively pursue the sort of securitized set of questions over, what does the new Taliban dispensation in Kabul mean for the rest of the region, largely in security terms. But I think you're right. We now have a living, breathing Islamist government that we'll get to this, but that seems to have no obvious checks or reasons or opposition that will cause its demise. And so what does this mean for the region? And I will get to this, especially in the context of India and Pakistan. But before I do that, indulge me with this securitized line of questioning first. And I want to drill down now from the very broad level to the sub-state level. And I want to interrogate what seems to be at the heart of much of our conversation about the regional effects in Afghanistan, which is this relationship between the Taliban and the Pakistani security apparatus. It seems that the Taliban holds, I think, multiple identities, right? It undeniably portrays itself as a sort of pious religious group. It undeniably also has appeals to ethnic nationalism as a national resistance to foreign occupation. But it is also, or has been at least in the past, a proxy of the Pakistani state. So again, going basically in that same order, starting with you, Javid, I want to ask you, how do you weigh these multiple identities that the Taliban has, and which do you see as being the most salient or the most relevant going forward?
Yes, the Taliban hold multiple identities, but they also hold multiple in divided loyalties. In essence, when you look at it, I think at its core, the Taliban is an ideologically, religious Deobandi group. But it's also not a monolithic one, nor is it fully Deobandi, because Deobandis, with their headquarters in India, is a very peaceful group. So in the Taliban case, what they did over the years is to carve out their own very perverse version of this commercial Deobandi Islam, propped up by, some very unsavory, whiskey drinking Pakistani generals and colonels. And, Dr. Fair could, tell you story after story about this, and she will source it back to the Pakistanis as well. But the point I'm trying to make here is that the Taliban are no longer a resistant group, because, they are the government right now. They are the big dog in Kabul. And there are also no viable national resistance to them, definitely not as yet. So this, commercially viable religious view that they portray and they depict in public, and one that they promote to kind of lure, more and more resources and also manpower, speaking from a battlefield perspective, it does not, have more than, for example, 10% of the followers in Afghanistan. So, but they are undoubtedly a proxy group because the Taliban are not yet independent, definitely not independent from the Pakistani shackles, to paraphrase the Prime Minister of Pakistan. So one other point I wanted to make is that the Taliban's emirate is also about a small group of people that are created and represented by the very group. So it's not accountable to anyone but to themselves. And so their views, Deobandi or otherwise, they are written on a stone, and they're not open to interpretation. So in fact, within Afghanistan, there are ethnic minority groups within the country that are larger than the entire Taliban constituency, if you put it together, with 10 or 15 or 20%. So it is my concerted view that the Taliban would, increasingly push to create some kind of a, the Afghan version of an apartheid state. And as they get more and more comfortable in their government seats, I think there will also be a push for this minority rule over a majority. And we'll also see them, we're already, seeing this, how they've increasingly become internally oppressive, but they will also start to become externally aggressive as they settle in their seat and start to enjoy the resources that the government has to offer. And I say this because at the end of the day, the ideology that the Taliban represents, it really matters to them, because without that ideology, the Taliban will be normal Afghans. So the ideology is the Taliban's brand, like however perverse that ideology may be. And we've already seen in recent weeks their practices, their morality police is on the march, the capital punishments, the lynching, the public stoning, the shaming, media, subjugation, in most cases, media completely non-existent. So forced disappearances, even, they've grown significantly. And the way they have done the mapping of Kabul and major cities, to target folks from judges to members of the former government, is just astounding. My own family house in Kabul was spray painted by the Taliban. So, but yes, it's not a monolithic group, and it's not homogeneous groups. And I think this is something that they will have to reconcile among themselves before they start to engage with the world.
Yeah, thank you, Javid. I think that's a really important point, because I think many of our sort of analytic problems come from when we try and provide some sort of monocausal explanation for the Taliban's power or appeal, when in fact it does, because it has so many loyalties and so many identities, it does seem to straddle this. Christine and Avinash, I wonder if I could ask you to explain to us, setting aside the sort of historical links between Taliban and ISI, let's take that as read, right? Conventional wisdom. I wonder if I can ask you to sort of explain what is the sort of empirical understanding, the specifics of the current day relationship between the Taliban and ISI, because I know we have a lot of historical evidence of this, and as I was discussing offline with Avinash earlier, you know, there was a lot of very useful Pakistani reporting, press reporting about this until that all dried up. But my question to you two is, how do we know about the relationship between the Taliban and the ISI, the current day relationship, and the sort of corollary of that is, how will we know, or how confident will we be of changes in that relationship, right? Because we can sort of broadly say, yes, there's a relationship, broadly say, yes, the Talibs are a proxy of the Pakistani state, but especially now, it would be useful to have a more fine-grained understanding of that relationship, right? And do we have that sort of insight? Christine?
I mean, of course we do, right? So I don't think it's a coincidence that DGISI rolls up to Afghanistan the day before the Panjshir offensive. We don't even need to speculate, really, with too much bravery in terms of what that was about. There has been a lot of observation how the Taliban, who have largely been unsophisticated adapters of technology, many of whom were able to fly Black Hawk helicopters. I mean, one of the perpetual problems that the Americans had in trying to create an indigenous air capacity was really the same kind of problems that undermined our efforts to build a truly broadly efficacious Afghan National Army, and that was in numeracy and illiteracy. But we also know who does fly the Black Hawk helicopters quite competently. We also saw repeated evidence of Chinese drones. Do we have any belief whatsoever that the Taliban, who again, they're certainly no more competent or capable than the Afghan population from which they draw? There's wide speculation, and I think it's probably beyond speculation, that these capabilities are also coming from the Pakistanis. I think for me, one of the biggest imprimaturs of the Pakistani influence upon this government is actually the presence of Pakistani Pashtuns that are actually in the Taliban government. And I think most importantly, the presence of Sirajuddin as the Ministry of Interior. I think, as everyone knows, the Ministry of Interior, that's the job you want if you want to engage in wanton criminality, right? Because it's the ministry that oversees the police. If you want to engage in smuggling, whether you're thinking about smuggling gems, timber, or poppy, you have to be in charge of the Ministry of Interior. It is incomprehensible to me that the Taliban would, of its own accord, say, okay, Haqqani Network, you get to have this really posh ministerial appointment. That is very much the imprimatur of the ISI. So again, the ISI, we have to take our hats off to the ISI and acknowledge this enormous skill set that they really have perfected over the past 7 decades during which they've been doing this. They are able to get off the jihad tiger and then get back on it. And what do I mean by that? So Afghans for many years, and I think Javid and I, we would meet frequently in both Bamiyan as well as in Herat and in Kabul before he got posted to Sri Lanka. Afghans had been really adamant for a number of years that the Pakistanis were in fact behind the Islamic State in Afghanistan. And, you know, I was a little bit reticent to buy that until I really began looking into the problem set. When I see a lot of DC-based analysts looking at the Islamic State in Afghanistan, there's this tendency for them to export what they think they knew about ISIS in Iraq and Syria and map that onto Afghanistan. You know, essentially, this is the DC rigmarole of an Insta expert. When they don't actually have germane expertise, they'll basically ride on the coattails of expertise that's not terribly relevant, but they can sell as nonetheless adjacent. But if you actually look at the Islamic State in Afghanistan, with the exception of some very early preliminary contacts with al-Baghdadi's emirate, these guys were mostly disgruntled Taliban that had reflagged. Some of them were annoyed at the Taliban's proximity to Pakistan. Mostly they are Deobandis. They are coming from this archipelago of sectarian groups in Pakistan like Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, Sip-e-Sabeh, Pakistan. And even before al-Baghdadi had declared the caliphate, many of the Pakistanis associated with these groups were going to Syria and Iraq to kill Shia and Alawites, respectively. So if you kind of think about how Pakistan operates and how it's always managed the Deobandi groups, it has a different business model with the Deobandis than it does Lashkar-e-Taiba. Lashkar-e-Taiba has this very hierarchical structure because it is incredibly safe. It doesn't have a large constituency across Pakistan. LA Hadithis, and particularly those that ascribe to the Lashkar-e-Taiba model, they are a very small number of Pakistanis. And because they are at variance with the ulama of LA Hadiths and Pakistan generally, they don't have access to this larger pool of funding through mosques and madrasas and through outside sources of income. So they are much more dependent upon the Pakistani deep state. Deobandis, and I'm glad Javid mentioned this. I wish he had went a little bit further. Afghans, like most of Pakistanis, they're actually they're Sufis, for lack of a better word. They follow different Sufi orders. So most Afghans are actually Naqshbandis, in the same way that most South Asian Muslims are actually followers of these mystical traditions, Nizamuddin, which is the Chishti order, Dr. Ganj Bakhsh, and so forth. The Deobandis, if you look at their market share of madrasas, however, they have the largest share of madrasas, and these are very lucrative propositions. So the Deobandi milieu has produced a number of Kashmir-oriented groups, Harkatul Jihad Islami, Harkatul Islam, Harkatul Mujahideen, Jaish-e-Mohammed, this whole alphabet soup of Deobandis. So the Pakistanis have largely used divide and conquer. When one group gets to be too big for its britches, it cultivates another group as a viable competitor. And so in my view, I see the ISIs imprimatur in calculating and cultivating the Islamic State as a competitor to the Taliban. If you look at the Islamic State's attack in Kabul and you ask who benefits, in the biggest picture is Pakistan who benefits, because what Pakistan is essentially now saying to the United States, and of course the Biden administration is very predictably falling for this nonsense, is that without an embassy in Kabul, you don't have any intelligence assets. Your drone program is essentially fruitless without these intelligence assets. Let us be your snake wranglers. And we're falling for it. I mean, we've seen the high-level visits to Pakistan. We see the priming of the ground that we're going to go back to this poisonous Pakistani well, and we are, once again, as we did in the 1990s, we're going to basically outsource much of our policy in Afghanistan to the Pakistanis. And so the primary beneficiary of ISIS in Afghanistan is the ISI. I'm curious to know what Javid and Avinash think. I'm perhaps known for being perhaps overly cynical about the Pakistani state, but my track record has regrettably been pretty much on point with these guys.
So it sounds like what you're suggesting, and Avinash, please comment on this. And let's start now. In fact, we can even start zooming out to some of these other networks as well. But it sounds like what you're suggesting is that it's almost like a form of competition policy, right? That they're trying to almost regulate the market, trying to keep some.
That's exactly what they're doing. That's exactly what they're doing.
So that there's no monopolistic group of bad guys, right? So
except them, the ISI.
Well, so if that's the case, Avinash, can you sort of pull that thread a little? And I know now I'm putting you on the spot because I earlier asked you a different question, but just cognizant of the timing here, let's expand this a little bit. Please address that to the extent you want to, but also I want to now get into these other networks that we've only sort of glancingly mentioned, like LET, like GEM, like even TTP, right? What is the impact of August 15 on these other groups? What, you know, the sort of simplistic, instinctive reaction is that now with the jihad in Afghanistan wrapped up and with the Talibs in power, the concern is that armed men are looking for a fight somewhere else. Is that too simplistic? Is that something we should actually be concerned about?
Thank you, Erzan. Again, look, let me take a step back from the security fallout of this moment, and I'll come to that in a second. And first look at simply the politics of it, right? What such pivotal moments in history do to states and different actors who make this history. And I think that's very important to kind of recognize that. First of all, you mentioned jihad wrapped up in Afghanistan. I don't think the Taliban is thinking along those lines. I don't think the jihad has been wrapped up. I think it's a new, different chapter of different kind of jihad, but this is a continuum. This is not an end point. In fact, perhaps less than the ISI itself and how it sees the Taliban in a utilitarian sense, in a strategic, security utilitarian sense. The Taliban who have a complex, competing, but still a core body of ideologues are viewing this moment entirely differently in a very political ideological sense. And the manifestation of that is being witnessed both in the way they are panning out or implementing governance mechanisms within Afghanistan, whether it's related to education, whether it's related to security, whether it's related to simply kind of providing day-to-day healthcare. These are the issues. You can see how they're dealing with, issues of policy and personnel domestically, and it's very clearly cliqued, very clearly, couched in an Islamic framework. Now, when you have a moment of this sort where an Islamist movement, and I coming back to this question of, what is Taliban really? Is it an Islamist or a nationalist group? I unreservedly believe that this is an Islamist group which has, of course, co-opted ideas of ethnic nationalism, whether it's of the Pashtun kind, persuasion or any else, for its kind of larger ideological aims. The fact that it did not, at least when it was fighting as an insurgent body, advocate a global jihad in rhetoric, even though it maintained international connectivity with all different kinds of transnational jihadis, it does so even today. Al-Qaeda, TTP, ETIM, LET-JM that you have mentioned. And the fact that it did not actually go for changing the territorial boundaries of a recognized nation state, unlike its IS counterpart in the Middle East and the Levant, where they were really playing around with post-colonial boundaries, which is really systemic in many ways and which will create pressures, and which did create pressures that led to their eventual downfall. That was the genius of the Taliban in many ways. And I don't say the word genius in a qualitatively good way, but this is how is the curry of success for them, right? This means that groups like the Lashkar, groups like the Jaish, groups like the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan will first and foremost be politically and psychologically be emboldened, right? Including the ISKP. And of course, there's this whole kind of state intrastate dyad working out between Afghanistan, Pakistan, and in the security studies which Christine has already elaborated. But just think about it from an ideological point of view. TTP feels much more emboldened to take on Pakistan today than it ever was. And this is coming after years of Operation Zarb-e-Azb, which was a very brutal counterinsurgency operation launched by the Pakistani army beginning 2014. So you can feel the confidence coming out. And this has been supported tactically as well. Now, people often focus on some group like the Gul Bahadur group trying to cut some deal with the ISI or the Pakistani leadership. or the Taliban, the Afghan Taliban trying to negotiate between the two entities. It's a very odd kind of an argument. Just look at the timeline, starting 15th of August till now. The first few prison breaks, the prison escapes that happened, they were actually before the Haqqanis took control of Kabul in toto, right? This is still, you can see the struggle between the Haqqanis and different rivaling Taliban factions to assert territorial controls on some very strategically consequential spaces of Afghanistan, whether they're urban spaces or whether they're prison spaces. And the exodus that happens from those prisons across the country, but definitely Pule, Turkey, it's actually very well curated. Again, I don't want to sound that everything has been calculated to the last detail, but you can broadly see that the people who are killed, I think around 8 ISKP members, leaders were shot dead, but the rest were allowed to go. Almost 2,000 plus TTP cadre, including officials, senior kind of commanders, they were just let go. They went. And that has essentially strengthened the TTP core cadre in ways that the TTP has not experienced in a long time. And that has very serious implications for both Pakistan and Afghanistan moving forward. And I think this is where things become really dangerous for the region, right? There is a concern. Now, of course, ISI, the Pakistani army, still, it has enough control mechanisms to manage these groups, to make them fight each other, to reward some and to penalize others. It did so with the Afghan Taliban itself, right? Penalizing Mullah Rasul, penalizing Mullah Baradar, penalizing Akhtar Mansoor by getting him droned out, but supporting Haqqanis and supporting Zakir at different points in time, and now marginalizing the pro-Iran factions like Ibrahim Sadr. So those mechanisms are very much there, and they use those control mechanisms with all these groups. But the fact is that the rise of the Taliban has further lurched the political landscape of Pakistan further to the right. And that is a very consequential moment. From here on, regardless of who will be the next chief of army staff, they say it's going to be Hamid Gul, who's the architect of this win. And we have a new ISI chief. These are officers who will be dealing with much more battle-hardened, much more ideologically committed, regardless of the brand of Islam they practice, committed sort of Islamists, both inside Pakistan and outside. And this will have an impact on countries like India, right? Where you can see this, the government of India has made huge mistakes in Kashmir, starting 2009, August 5, since the decision it took of getting rid of the statehood of Jammu and Kashmir, there have been a cascading set of events which really don't portend well for the region on a whole in a political sense. And I personally believe for India, the concern should not be specific to Kashmir. The scope of concern or security concern even for India is actually at a national level, not just Kashmir. In fact, Kashmir is one space where I'm actually much more confident of India being able to handle the security repercussions given the infrastructure it has. But how do you deal with the fact that in Assam, you're having all these movements where there's a whole lot of polarization? How do you deal with the fact that a lot of youth from South India, different states, Karnataka, Kerala, Andhra, are going and getting radicalized either in the Gulf or back home, and then joining all these fringe groups? Now, yes, these are not strategic threats in the sense that they don't challenge the existence. It doesn't make India existentially concerned. But when you look at these threats from the perspective, including coming from LET and Jesh, and we have seen the number of the LOC ceasefire, which was recently curated using back channels, has actually broken down. Over the past 3 weeks, there have been very serious attempts of infiltration, which have required a lot of proactive military kind of responses by the Indian armies and the intelligence grid in Kashmir across the board. And you can see that when, for New Delhi, you're having a huge standoff with the Chinese, you're having a complete takeover of Afghanistan by the Taliban, and you're having your eastern neighborhood, which is Myanmar, completely imploding. And that's a very serious country that people are actually not focusing on and has very serious security concerns for India in its east. And your relationship with Bangladesh is hinging on the viability, both personal, individual, and political viability of one political figure in Sheikh Hasina. You're really on tenterhooks. Let's be very honest about that. So this is where my concerns really are, talking about these different groups. It's a wider political concern. We are looking at more extremes, political extremes. And this will manifest in some sort of security incident, which can spiral out of control without countries being able to bring them, de-escalate tensions at any future point in time.
So this is a really important and bleak dimension to this. Javid, I'm gonna ask you to chime in on this. That essentially what it seems like what you're saying is that what we see is now Afghanistan once again serving as the incubator of transnational militancy across the region, but now supercharged because there's also this added political dimension of a fillip to Islamism and Islamist governance. Javid, can I ask you to comment on this, on the sort of long-term impact, right? Not the Taliban per se, not even AQ per se, but the long-term impact on the militancy milieu or the ecosystem of Islamism, and not even necessarily Islamist, but other militancy across the region, spanning right from Iran right through to Bangladesh. How do you see this long-term impact of August 15 on the region?
Absolutely. Just very briefly, first, to your, just a quick addition to your few points that Avinash made to your earlier question about the ISI support to the Taliban. Look, I was from, I had a courtside seat, since I was on the inside, and I was privy to a lot of conversation. And I can tell you, and this is no secret, that the war in Afghanistan was directed from government spaces inside Pakistan. So I saw it, as I was privy to some of these conversations from the inside, serving as the Afghan ambassador in the UAE. I can tell you that in the last 6 months, ISI had a very strong embedded tactical presence in Taliban units inside Afghanistan. So there were ISI captains and, there were colonels, some of them even, heard on intercepts, on phone intercepts and radio intercepts, speaking about planning and coordination, speaking in broken Pashto and in broken Dari and Farsi. I personally heard some intercepts, the Taliban members are referring to them, to their interlocutors on the ISI side as Captain Saab, and that was actually in Urdu. So I saw it, from the inside, that starting in March of this year, there was a deluge of thousands of fighters that entered Afghanistan from Pakistan, and they were not all Pashtun fighters either. So I can tell you that when General Bajwa and ISI chief would meet with the Afghan leadership, they would demand, and I want to repeat, they would demand that the Afghan leadership incentivize the Taliban and allow them to make money, literally, allow the Afghan Taliban to make money so they could feel included. So that was their formula of inclusion and integration or reconciliation, all in all. But when the Afghan would actually say that we're going to go engage them militarily, the Pakistanis, strictly, and very strongly opposed it. So, look, the Taliban is not a militarily sophisticated group. It employed a very, resource efficient military approach. They determine when and where to target Afghan forces, and we saw from the inside. They also attacked where the Afghan forces were at its weakest. So, but in almost every instance, their planning, was impeccable. So I can tell you that the most well-trained Afghan forces didn't even know how to read a map. But, in almost every medium-sized Taliban tactical unit on the ground that we encountered, there was a tactical map reader, obviously trained, properly trained. So, the ISI presence, was on the front line in Afghanistan, and there were elements, of the Pakistani Special Service Group, which is basically their, tactical special forces unit as well. And we saw it, we heard them, they effectively reorganized the Taliban's force posture. They managed to build, very sort of tactical alliances between the different groups, including the Haqqanis, including LET, the Afghan Taliban. In some cases, some of the kind of, turned ISK or, ISKP fighters as well. So the coordination was just impeccable. Now, as to your second question.
Wait, sorry, Javid. Hang
Yes.
on. This is huge. This is really interesting, and I want to just pick at this a little bit. And I want you to complete the second question. But before I forget, I also just want to finish that thought, because you seem to suggest that it began in March, this sort of concerted mentoring offensive campaign, right? This concerted mentoring of an offensive campaign starting in March, essentially, now correct me if I'm wrong, to achieve battlefield decision, to achieve a battlefield victory in Afghanistan? Is that what you're suggesting? And if that's the case,
Absolutely, absolutely.
And this is what I ask you, and I'd also, after you've said your piece, ask Avinash and Christine, if that's the case, how do you square that circle? Because it seems to me that the Pakistani interest was in maintaining this sort of unstable Afghanistan, where it had a lot of influence, but where a Taliban monopoly of power in Afghanistan may actually be injurious to Pakistani interests. No, is that, am I getting that wrong? And I'll ask Avinash and Christine to chime in on this, because I think, Avinash, you've also written about this sort of the 1971 moment, right, for Pakistan. That could actually wind up being a point of inflection where Pakistan winds up losing leverage, losing influence in Afghanistan, if the Talibs have a monopoly on power in Afghanistan. So if that's the case, then explain to me Pakistani thinking where they seek complete control that may, in the broader sense, actually be self-defeating. Go ahead, Javid, then I'll ask Christine and Avinash.
I personally felt a greater disconnect between the Pakistani military leadership and their civilian leadership, even though the civilian leadership spoke for the military leadership, but they were not fully in sync. So that's one. Within the military leadership, there was also a great deal of disconnect, a mismatch, because, you know, folks at the generals level would say one thing, but when you trickle down to the colonels, majors, and captains level who were on the battlefield in Afghanistan, they did completely opposite. So in many cases, that disconnect played a great role in determining whether or not what the Pakistanis were demanding from the Afghan leadership would actually be bought by the tactical ISI guys who were marshaling the day-to-day war efforts on the ground. That's one. The desired end state that the Pakistanis demanded and they effectively worked for, even though they played a very ambiguous role during the peace talks, because nobody knew what they conceded, nobody knew what their role was, or what they did or what they didn't do. But their desired end state, as I collected from conversations after conversation and listening in, is that they didn't want a political solution, a political settlement. They wanted a military settlement first. Then the military, the contours of then the military settlement would essentially guide and dictate the terms of a follow-on political solution to Afghanistan. And of course, in order for you to have a military settlement, you would have to, you know, push and strengthen and boost and bolster your clients. And in this case, we saw starting say late February, March, mid-March, after, you know, the weather got a little bit more warmer, a deluge of fighters crossing into Afghanistan. And then you know, and they were a hold force essentially. You know, some fought, some were a hold force, and we saw it. So, but yes, they were on the front line, and we I can tell you that this, you could even, you know, characterize this as a in a sort of non-conventional sense as a coup of sorts.
Christine, and then Avinash.
I mean, I'm really glad that Javid said what he did, because I think all of us that have been watching this space knew this. The Pakistanis also, through this kind of unrestrained, unlimited military assistance and helping the Taliban take over Afghanistan in the first place. And of course, all of us remember the Kunduz airlift, where Pakistan actually asked the Americans, hey, we've got our ISI trainers working with the Talibs. Do you mind if we make some sorties to get them out? And some of my colleagues who were special operators at the time, they said that the number of sorties were actually much larger than even Seymour Hersh had reported. And we now know that the ISI used those sorties to actually ferret out the Taliban. And we know that from the time that the Americans routed them in late 2001 to 2005, when they relaunched themselves in Afghanistan, that the Pakistanis were solely behind this relaunch. When I look at this history, there's a couple of things that I find really problematic about the Pakistanis early on. And for this, I have to put the culpability squarely, really in the hands of the Americans, or the feet of the Americans. So many people will remember that in December of 2001, Jaish-e-Mohammed, which is a very old ally of the Taliban, they launch a suicide attack on the Indian parliament. And this precipitates the largest military buildup between India and eventually Pakistan since the 1971 war. General Orakzai at the time was the 11th Corps commander based in Peshawar. It is precisely during the attack and in the subsequent Pakistani remobilization of forces from the west to the east that the Americans have the most consistent, all sources reporting that Osama bin Laden is in Tora Bora. It is during this period when General Orakzai and Musharraf basically tells Ambassador Wendy Chamberlain that we have no choice. We have to move our forces from west to east. I'm not someone who believes in coincidences, especially something as momentous as this. And we also know that it's during this period, not only does Osama bin Laden make his way into Pakistan, but in fact, so do many of the Taliban fighters that are going to spend their recuperative break in Fatah moving onward. So we actually see, in my view, there's just, how likely is it that Jaish-e-Mohammed truly conducts an off-the-books operation of this strategic consequence at a time which precisely provides General Orakzai, who was a very well-known pro-Taliban sympathizer, that permits this massive escape of Taliban in, as well as, quite frankly, significant Al-Qaeda fighters into Pakistan. What I also found really problematic about this approach is that what are frequently called the rat lines, the exfiltration routes into and out of Afghanistan, they're not new rat lines, right? They're overdetermined by geology and the mountain passes, and they're also overdetermined by meteorology, which is to say the time of year. General Orakzai could have actually positioned a relatively small number of troops if he was truly interested in being what Pakistan was supposed to be, which was the anvil to the American hammer. So we actually see this complicity, complicity and duplicity really early on in the US-Pakistan relationship. But I also don't agree with this narrative that the Michael Kugelmans and the Ashley Jacksons of the analytical, and I do call names because I think there needs to be accountability for things that are said. If people are perfectly happy putting their names on an op-ed in the Washington Post or writing something for the Wilson Center, they should then expected to be called out by people who hold contrarian points of view. This has long been Pakistan's point of view. Well, how can we support the Taliban when we're like the biggest victims of Taliban terror? Well, the first thing is that the two organizations are not the same, although it's certainly the case that there would be no Pakistan Taliban had there not been an Afghan Taliban, but more importantly, had there not been a Jaish-e-Mohammed, had there not been a Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, had there not been a Sip-e-Sabe Pakistan, those groups are much more germane to the Pakistani Taliban than the Afghan Taliban per se. But what people don't understand is the cruelty of the generals in Pakistan's army. As long as Pashtuns are dying, this is collateral in the pursuit of the grand strategic strategy of the khaki masters. And if you look at the TTP, what was their greatest strategic overstep? It was the attack at Bunair, and then subsequently moving into the Punjab. And it's when they endangered the Punjabis' ability to, eat their halim in peace, and when they began attacking the Punjab police, when they began attacking the frontier constabulary, when Islamabad, many of us began calling it Islamabomb, this is when the Pakistanis' opinion towards them changed. Pakistan's view with respect to the Pakistani Taliban has always been of the following. They create these, to use the Indian expression, the ghar wapasi, the homecoming, if you will, of wayward Pakistani Taliban by encouraging them to either join Jaish-e-Mohammed or go fight in Afghanistan with the Taliban. And those that do not avail of these ghar wapasi opportunities, then they are singled out for military therapy. I don't think that the Pakistani Taliban is because Taliban regrettably is a plural noun, it requires a plural verb. I don't think the Taliban are going to make those same strategic miscalculation, which is, taking this fight to the Punjab. The Punjab remains the strategic ballast of Pakistan, and it's when you make the life of Pakistanis difficult when there's pressure to act. So I don't think they're going to do that. I think they're going to pursue their mission on the periphery. And this actually, in a perverse way, advances the strategic goals of Pakistan's deep state, which has been for the last several years really focusing its ire on the Pashtun, the PTM, the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement. So anything that it can do to legitimize its ongoing savagery and brutality of Pashtuns will actually be welcomed. So the story of how can we support these when we're the primary victim, I have to say, is one of the oldest and most efficacious rent-seeking narrative that the Pakistanis distribute through their various, how shall we put this delicately, their information operations assistants.
This is okay. We're really up against the clock, and this is.
Oh, are we? Oh crap, we are.
No, we are. So I regret that we have to change tack, because this is I think proving to be a really useful line of inquiry. But I just have time for one last round of questions, if you will indulge.
But Avinash didn't get a chance to respond to my cynical read of the deep state and how it derives benefit from Pakistanis and immiseration, as long as they're not Punjabi.
I just don't want to equate the region with Pakistan. I want to give other countries a bit of oxygen as well. So in that vein, let's go around. I'll change the order a little bit. Christine first, then Avinash, and then Javid. I'll ask you to conclude. Christine, if I can ask you about the impact of August 15 on China, right? So we've heard a lot of people talk about, well, now we, the Americans, have given Central Asia to the Chinese. They're going to exploit it for either resources or CPAC or whatever. But on the other hand, of course, the Chinese are also obviously very concerned about ETIM, about the vacuum of stability in the region. So I'll ask you, Christine, what do you think the impact of the Taliban takeover is on China's role in the region? Avinash, I'll ask you on a similar question, but for India. What does August 15 and the Taliban takeover mean for Indian policy, not just in Afghanistan, right? In fact, not in Afghanistan. But what do events in Afghanistan mean for India's role in the wider region, especially among other countries in the region? And Javid, I'll ask you to answer the question that I didn't give you a chance to answer before, which is on the impact of this on the whole sort of future of Islamism and militancy across the region. Again, as I said, from Iran to Bangladesh. I think Avinash has just dropped off, hopefully temporarily, and will rejoin. But let's go with Christine on China.
Oh no, China is just benefiting tremendously. And I actually don't buy for a second the very popular repines that the people are saying, oh, well, you know, China's really worried about the Taliban because of ETIM. So if you go back to Taliban 1.0, people may not know, or if they did know, they forgot that the Taliban was really close with China. China had a memorandum that they had signed with the Taliban to provide them various kinds of financial support. They were also providing, such as it was telecommunications infrastructure, they were also providing weapons. China, the Taliban were also very close to inking a very similar agreement with Osama bin Laden. And if you actually go back and look at what Osama bin Laden didn't say, right, even at that time period, China was genociding not just the Uyghurs, but just Muslims, period. I mean, your wife is one of the country's most important experts on China. So this isn't anything that was new. And Osama bin Laden never once mentioned China in any of his various musings. What China expected from the Taliban is essentially what it expected from the Pakistanis, which is when we ask you to roll up some potential problem children, you will roll them up. This is also why Pakistan has essentially not been a problem for Pakistan, even though it is essentially an archipelago of petting zoos of terrorists, because when the Chinese say, hey, we've got some Uyghurs that are kind of dubious, we want you to do the needful, they do the needful. So actually, China is one of the few countries I can think of that actually thinks in 100-year planning cycles, as opposed to the United States, which plans essentially in the lowest common denominator of a congressional House re-election. So, China has, throughout the last 20 years, has played footsie with the Taliban. The Russians knew about the rare earth mineral deposits. The Chinese have been one of the earliest and then also largest investors in Afghanistan. And it's only by getting those minerals out of the ground and into market that actually CPEC makes any sense. Right. So if you read, for example, Small's book on, although he's a little bit too friendly to both countries for my take. I mean, I guess that happens when you're relying upon visas, right? You can't like punch too hard. You have to be a little bit more reserved in your discussions. But he does make the point that the cost of moving a single barrel of crude from Gwadar into Xinjiang and vice versa is about 4 to 6 times more expensive than moving the same barrel of crude through an internal G-lock. So this absent and economically viable CPEC corridor, and I think you also did that drive through the Karakoram. Did you guys? Did you and Oriana do the KKH drive?
We did through Xinjiang up to the
Okay. Well, I've done the KKH drive. It is a really execrable highway. It's really not made for the kinds of transport that you need. You're going to have to blow up a lot of mountain. Right now, it's really difficult to move at different points. We're
gonna have to wrap it up, Christine.
Yeah, but my point is, it's only by connecting Gwadar to the ring road, right, that this becomes a viable enterprise. So China doesn't care about stability. All of its musings about an inclusive government, it's just a bunch of garbage. It's pretty straightforward what it wants. It wants the Taliban to facilitate getting that stuff out of ground into market. And I will also say the Taliban wanted, right? Because the Taliban doesn't care about international financing. It needs to find a way to pay for itself. It has understood this lesson perhaps better than Afghan governments like Ghani, who should have known better. So there is a symbiotic need. The Taliban need to get that stuff out of the ground into market, and no one has the risk acceptance, right? Look at the Chinese experience in building the infrastructure in Tibet, right? There's no other country that's going to do it. So anyone who's telling you, oh, the Chinese are very worried, they're really just not reading this situation properly.
Thank you. Thank you. Avinash, really briefly on India, and then Javid, really.
Can you hear me, Arzan?
Yes.
Perfect. So very quick 3 points. This August 15 is a strategic setback for India as far as Afghanistan is concerned. The core driver of India's Afghanistan policy, that is to ensure some sort of strategic balance between Afghanistan and Pakistan, has been lost out, right? The whole idea of ensuring that Afghans stand up on their own, on their own merit, for their own selves, and India is the partner in that endeavor against Pakistan or whatever else their aspirations might be. That is what India has lost out on 15th of August. And I think that's historically the only time India faced this earlier was, of course, on September 25th, 1996, when Kabul fell for the first time, right? The regional constellation was different then than it is now. So this moment in 2021 is much worse. The second point I want to talk about a little bit is India's attempts to reach out to the Taliban over the past few kind of years. Now, this was always half-hearted attempt. It never really had political sanction. It had bureaucratic sanction at higher levels at different points in time, but this conversation was in fits and starts, starting sometime with the kidnappings that began of Indian citizens in Afghanistan to post-2003, reaching a high in 2010-11, and then picking up sometime in 2017-18 to the recent outreach that we saw, where India is actually deliberately leaking information, which shows the kind of comfort New Delhi had at some point of actually engaging officially with the Taliban, shedding its own reluctance. And these are leaks which are very, very well timed leaks, really. But we also see something completely opposite happening at the same time. Every figure who was alleged to have had some kind of contact with India, whether it's on the ground or in Doha, Mullah Baradar in particular, all of them, or those figures who could have had relationship with India, which are the pro-Iranian factions in Helmand, all of them have been marginalized in the interim government, with those figures very close to Pakistan being in the forefront, especially Haqqani. And it shows just today, this morning, Anas Haqqani tweets about his visit to the grave of Mahmud of Ghazni and saying that we pray and, and this is the Mahmud was the one of Ghaznavi who actually destroyed the temples of Somnath. Now think about the impact, the psychological impact of talking of raising the temple of Somnath in India of 2021. That's the signaling that is happening. And that is something that needs to be factored in. The Indian right wing has already gone completely berserk because of that tweet. And if there was any chance, and I don't think there was any serious chance of India debating even recognition, that's completely out of the window. This is, we are seeing a hardening of security stance. And the last point, look, it also shows something about India that it is today, the situation in Afghanistan. The debate and the way India held the refugee policy and the kind of signaling that it did at the beginning, that we are, despite the Citizenship Amendment Act, we'll accept Afghans of all faiths, regardless of whether they are minorities or not, and then actually not delivering on that. And then the Home Ministry going one step forward to actually canceling the visas which have already been offered. You can see the politics of India has completely shifted to the Hindu right in a very fundamental sense, even vis-a-vis strategically consequential countries and allies like Afghanistan. This would have been unimaginable. And you can see this play out in bureaucratic politics, both the intelligence, external intelligence, and the Ministry of External Affairs really pushing, the security establishment pushing for these visas to be granted to secure those Afghans who have supported India and perhaps more, not just minority communities of Hindus and Sikhs, and the Home Ministry pushing back. And you can see that divide. That's an ideological divide, not just a bureaucratic one. So this is also a moment that reflects a lot on how far India has come in its own journey politically, in the way it deals with this crisis, and what it does not do. Perhaps it tells much more than what it actually does.
That's such an important point. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, that's a very important issue, that it's not just that the Taliban have come back to power. That's not the only thing that has changed. The region itself has changed fundamentally as well in the last 20 years. Javid, last word to you. Any concluding comments, any overarching observations you want to make or things you want to fill in?
Well, on the future of Islamism, and Avinash spoke to this before as well, I think that, the nature of jihadism and the nature of Islamism has morphed considerably, over the years, and definitely since the Taliban were first in government in 1990. So not every group or militant group, and there are a basket of them in Afghanistan, to which the Taliban were allied or against, they subscribe to the same Islamic view that the Taliban harbor. But we will see, in terms of the future of Islamism, with some kind of a base in Afghanistan, I think we'll see more commercial jihadism as a brand, probably promoted by certain segments of the Taliban, going forward. And I think after the Taliban's takeover itself, there are more and more jihadi groups, who are, looking at this sort of takeover as a working template to follow. I think we, like what the Taliban perhaps have, in common with some of the other groups is that they fought locally, as a jihadi group, as a takfiri group. They fought locally, but they also think and operated globally to attract support, to attract resources and manpower. So I think locally, the Taliban pursued that very approach. They fought to rid Afghanistan of foreign fighters, and they succeeded. But they also lent very critical support to their very codependent transnational partners like Al Qaeda, as they reconstituted themselves and they established very important footprint in, and not just in Afghanistan, but also in the Indian subcontinent. I think we will see, a future of Islamism, a militant rebranding. LAT, Jaish Mohammed could be, could very well be reoriented towards Kashmir. We'll also see TTP, which is an umbrella organization of several militant factions. They have reconstituted. They're much stronger now than they used to be, especially after more than half a dozen of splinter groups merge under the TTP's leadership. We'll also see the TTP's leader, Masood, Nur Ali Masood, is also seen as a very sort of charismatic, unifying face. So he would, coalesce the whole splinter TTP factions under his leadership. But because the TTP isn't a homogenous group, I think Pakistan will begin to push and bully the Taliban leadership in Kabul to go after, certain TTP or the bad TTP, quote unquote. And then at the same time, the ISI will work to cultivate some TTP factions through negotiations, as they recently revealed that they are in talks with. The last point I want to make is that all in all, and I think Pakistan is a ticking bomb, and it appears that besides the TTP, the very likely emergence of other tactical partnerships between a basket of militant groups in Afghanistan or in Pakistan will be a very bad news for Pakistan and security. And that's why I think we're very likely to see some significant reorientation in jihadi groups and jihadi ideology as well. And Pakistan will have a very tough time to manage it all. Now, what Pakistan may find particularly challenging is to manage the internal rifts and the internal frictions within the Taliban leadership in Kabul right now, particularly between the southern or the Quetta-Shor Taliban from southern Afghanistan, Helmand and Kandahar, and also the Haqqani camps. Now, I think because of the Taliban's own internal problems, the Taliban's leadership, moderate or hardliners, their attitude towards these, transnational Islamic movements will be determined once it becomes clear which Taliban faction will dominate the internal power struggle in Kabul. But whoever emerges in this internal power struggle, it is my considered view that we should not expect the Taliban to push for the withdrawal of foreign fighters from Afghanistan.
Thank you so much. Look, I am so grateful to you all. There's a ton we didn't get to cover. There's a lot of questions that were asked that we didn't get to address, and I apologize to the audience for that. And I'm so grateful to you guys for lending your expertise. I mean, one of the big takeaways for me is that this is not just a matter for Afghanistan, and this is not just another milestone in what's happened in Afghanistan. This could be as pivotal a moment as 2001 or 1979 in terms of resetting not just security issues in the region, but also politics in the region. So thank you for exploring a lot of those points. Thank you all for being so rigorous, for using evidence based on history or your access. And I really think that we've offered a bit of a really in-depth and useful tutorial on what's happening in the region as a result of August 15. Thank you very much.